Bien, bonsoir. Merci beaucoup d'être là pour venir écouter mon collègue et ami Derek Welsby. Il habite en Turquie, mais il a travaillé au British Museum pendant la plus grande partie de sa carrière. Et pour en dire quelques mots, parce que vous avez déjà des éléments dans la plaquette que je tiens dans les mains, ce que je voudrais dire de lui, c'est que c'est si vous me permettez, l'archéologue idéal. Il a du métier, c'est une chose. Sa femme est archéologue également. Et il a une Land Rover. Et du coup, je l'ai toujours connu comme un infatigable parcoureur des pistes du Soudan. Et il faut savoir lutter contre sa fatigue. Et du coup, il en a une connaissance extrêmement profonde, extrêmement détaillée de nombreux sites. Il va nous en faire profiter aujourd'hui. En tout cas, il y a 3 sites qui sont attachés à son nom. C'est ceux de Soba, celui de Kawa, et puis celui désormais sous l'eau de la 4e cataracte. Soba, c'est au sud de Khartoum, 14 km au sud de Khartoum, sur le Nil bleu, la capitale du plus méridional des royaumes chrétiens du Soudan, le royaume d'Aloa ou Alodia. Kawa, c'est une des villes saintes du royaume de Kush. Elle est illustrée notamment dans l'exposition en ce moment Pharaon des 2 terres. Une des villes où le souverain intronisé devait se présenter devant le dieu Amon pour être consacré par le maître du temple. Et la 4e cataracte, site d'un des projets hydrauliques que certains pays affectionnent encore beaucoup, a marqué, nous étions d'ailleurs embarqués dans la même opération de sauvetage, a marqué les dernières décennies de l'archéologie au Soudan. Il a fallu sauver tout ce qui pouvait l'être, un peu de la même façon que l'avaient été les opérations pour le barrage d'Assouan. Il a été président de la Société internationale des études nubiennes de 2002 à 2010. Et j'ai eu l'honneur de lui succéder à cette fonction. Je le dis parce que à la fin de l'année, là, il y aura l'anniversaire, le 50e anniversaire de cette Société internationale des études nubiennes, qui donc étudie les antiquités au sud de la première cataracte dans le pays qu'est le Soudan. Mais je parle trop. I give you the word, Derek. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Vincent, for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be here in this august institution and to be involved, even if only in a very small way, with the Cushite exhibition organised by the Louvre. I would like to thank my colleague and friend, the Director of the Egyptian Antiquities Department, Dr. Vincent Rondeau, for inviting me to present this talk on the Korosko Road, which may serve to highlight the desert regions which comprised a part of, or at least bordered upon, much of the Kushite Empire on its eastern flank. For the ancient as well as the modern states which flourished in what is now Sudan and Egypt, the Nile plays a crucial role. It provided the vast bulk of drinking water for the populations of those countries and has always been essential for much of their agricultural productivity. In the context of this talk, another aspect of the Nile is important. Its use as a means of communication, the movement of people and goods from Central Africa to the Mediterranean world and beyond, and vice versa. It provides the only means of crossing the world's largest desert on Earth while having access to copious amounts of potable water. In much of Egypt, and in parts of the river's course in Sudan, it is an ideal waterway with its broad and placid stream. Vessels are able to sail downstream, aided by the current, and move upstream for most of the year, harnessing the power of the prevailing north winds. The numerous depictions of boats in the rock art of the Pharaonic period, as well as epigraphic evidence, demonstrates that it was a major artery for the movement of people and presumably of goods. In northern Sudan, some of the traditional wooden sailing boats, the morkab, are still in use for local transport of goods and people along the river, from one bank to the other, and to provide access to the islands. During the last century, long-distance trade across the river has ceased. Upstream of Aswan, however, there are some serious obstacles to navigation, most notably the cataracts. 6 cataracts have been numbered. The first cataract is immediately upstream of Aswan, while the southernmost, the 6th cataract, is about 80 kilometers north of Khartoum. At the cataracts, bands of hard rock lie across the river's channel, creating rapids of varying severity. At the 6th cataract, these rapids are in one place only. At the other extreme, in the 4th cataract, there are innumerable rapids over many tens of kilometers. The situation in the 4th cataract is made even worse for navigation, as this stretch of the river, and for some distance downstream, the river's course runs from northeast to southwest, close to the direction of the prevailing wind, making sailing upstream extremely difficult. As well as the numbered cataracts, there are also a very large number of others, some of which posed a serious problem to the movement of boats, especially when the river's water level was low. This is one of those unnumbered cataracts at Kajbar. To aid movement of boats through one of the most severe rapids at the 2nd cataract, the Egyptians constructed a slipway lined with mud, along which vessels could be dragged around the obstacle. Nile mud is extremely slippery when wet, so water will have been poured onto the slipway to aid the dragging of the boats. Similar technology was also used by the Egyptians to move heavy statuary, as depicted here, with a man standing on the front of the sledge pouring water onto the mud. This slipway was discovered and excavated under the direction of the eminent French Egyptologist Jean Vercuter in the winter of 1963 to 64 near the fortress of Megissa. At the Semna Cataract, 3 forts and a wall several kilometers long on the west bank of the river protected the point where boats may have been unloaded, their cargoes being transshipped to other vessels on the far side of the cataract, or to lighten the vessels to allow them to pass through the rapids and avoid hitting the underwater boulders as they sailed down the rapids or were dragged upstream. Moving through the cataracts continued to be a problem up to recent times. These images depict the movement upstream of troops belonging to the Gordon Relief Expedition of 1884-5. The boats are being hauled up the cataracts using the same technology as was available to the ancient Egyptians. In more recent times, the Nile has been an obstacle to movement from one bank to the other, particularly for motor vehicles. Now this is much less of a problem with the construction of bridges to the north of Khartoum over the last 2 decades. Another great problem with the use of the Nile and its valley as a route is the sinuous course taken by the river. As can be seen from some of the figures presented here, that the river route is vastly longer than those by land, which cut across its bends. Yet another difficulty for anyone passing along the valley was, at certain periods, caused by the political and security situation. At many periods, the traveller or merchant would have had to pass through territory controlled by a number of local chiefs, governors, or kings and queens, some of whom were mutually antagonistic. At best, taxes would be demanded. At worst, goods could be stolen and their owners murdered. The political situation was the reason for the Byzantine missionary Bishop Longinus taking the desert route in AD 580 on his way from the medieval kingdom of Nobadia to Alwa in the face of antagonism between Nabatea and its upstream neighbour Makuria. These factors are the background to the genesis of the cross-desert routes, of which the Korosko Road was one. Today, the region traversed by the Korosko Road is barren desert, which supports little in the way of plant and animal life. This is a very hostile environment to which man is not physically well adapted. However, as we know all too well at the present, climatic conditions do vary over time, and in marginal zones such as the Eastern Desert, even minor fluctuations can have a significant impact. While the present global warming phenomenon is closely linked to human activities over the last few centuries, previous climatic changes were entirely natural and, depending where one happened to be, could either improve or reduce opportunities for human settlement and other activities. One of these major fluctuations occurred in the early Holocene, the era spanning the last 10,000 years. In the early Holocene, the climatic zones and the annual rains associated with them shifted northwards in the area under discussion, perhaps by as much as 500 kilometres. The map on the left, resulting from the research carried out in the western Libyan desert by German colleagues under the direction of Dr. Rudolf Cooper, illustrates the shift of climatic zones, while those on the right document the colonization of what had been desert by humans and the start of the gradual retreat back to the oasis of the Nile Valley as what is termed the Holocene wet phase began to wane. At its height, the Holocene wet phase transformed the Sahara Desert into a savanna, probably similar to what is seen today in central Sudan, here close to Khartoum and in northern Kordofan. This savanna was inhabited by a wide range of animals, including big game such as elephants and giraffe. This environment was equally favourable to humans, providing drinking water and also food available from foraging and hunting. The presence of these animals and of the human population is clear from naturalistic depictions of them carved onto rock outcrops across the Sahara. In this context, crossing the Eastern Desert from north to south, although perhaps still perilous, will not have posed the more recent problems, principally the availability of water, but also of food for travellers and their pack and transport animals. For cross-desert travel, the ancient Egyptians made use of the donkey, an animal still widely used today in northern Sudan. The donkey, however, is not well suited to the desert. It requires water at least every 3 days, which, if carried by the animal itself, along with water for the travellers, greatly reduced its capacity to carry goods or people. To facilitate cross-desert travel on some routes, the Egyptians established water depots, jars filled with water placed at intervals along the route, the most famous of which is the Abu Balas Trail, leading from Dakhla Oasis southwest towards the Gilf Kebir, close to the modern borders of Libya, Egypt and Sudan. The viability of using the donkey to move from Egypt to Sudan across the desert depended entirely on the climatic conditions, which, as has been noted, were subject to change. It is generally considered that the climate along which what later became known as the Korosko Road may have been a little wetter during the Pharaonic period than it is today, but that conditions were gradually deteriorating and reached the present hyper-arid regime by the early 1st millennium BC. The use of the camel revolutionized desert travel. This animal is able to go without water for up to 15 days and thus was able to cross large tracts of waterless desert. However, the watering interval does vary greatly according to the ambient temperature and the amount of fodder available along the way. The camel is first recorded in our area around 1000 BC, but probably did not come into common use until the early centuries of the current era, that is in the mid to later Kushite period. A number of cross-desert routes are known connecting Egypt to Sudan and crossing the desert in Sudan itself. Probably many more could be added to this map, some used occasionally, some more extensively. Much of what follows in this talk is based on the results of archaeological work by two missions. The first, and by far the most extensive, was undertaken by Alfredo and Angelo Castiglioni, two Italians from Varese, between 1989 and 2006. They, along with their small team, sponsored by the Italian vehicle manufacturer Iveco, travelled extensively across the eastern desert, recording a wide range of archaeological sites on both sides of the Egyptian-Sudanese border. Much of their work is published, some of it in profusely illustrated books, such as this one. Although the Castiglionis and their teams were keen observers of the archaeological remains, it was not part of their brief to study the Egyptian inscriptions which they found or visited in detail. To address this issue, in 2013, Vivian Davis, at that time keeper of the Department of Ancient Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum, organised an expedition with the full support of Sudan's National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums to specifically study the inscriptions, he being assisted in this task by Bert Verrept. Meanwhile, the other members of the team recorded the archaeological remains in the vicinity of the inscriptions and studied the pottery. The publication resulting from these activities falls into two parts. Part one provides an overview of the work of the Castiglionis, authored by themselves, along with reports by a number of specialists on the pottery and the lithic tools found by them. Part two focuses on the results of the Sudan Archaeological Research Society's epigraphic and archaeological survey. Until the early years of this century, there was a general assumption that the archaeological sites in the desert were largely safe from destruction, being in areas difficult of access and very inhospitable to modern development. This, coupled with the difficulty of mounting archaeological expeditions in the desert and the attractions of the very rich sites in the Nile Valley, meant that few archaeologists have ventured there. Vehicles that can cope with the desert are essential. They have to contend with extremely rough, boulder-strewn terrain in places and extremely soft sand in others. All necessities of life have to be carried: food, water and fuel. Running out of any of these is problematic, as is the breakdown of a vehicle. A minimum of 2 vehicles is certainly required. Living conditions are basic. Here our cook, Mohammed, in 2013, is setting up his kitchen in the Wadi Murat. And here our dining room in the Bar Basilik. Sat at the table one day during dinner, a member of the team happened to look down and spotted this hand axe on the ground under the table. It had been lying around since the Middle Paleolithic, some 200,000 years ago. In the very recent past, this sense of isolation in Sudan's eastern desert, as in parts of the western Libyan desert, has vanished. Sudan is currently gripped by a gold rush, which is causing devastation across the hitherto largely pristine desert environment, as well as destroying innumerable archaeological sites. Of course, this is not the first gold rush in the eastern desert. The reason the ancient Egyptians were there was the lure of gold, and this continued at many later periods. The latest commercial venture close to the Korosko Road was at Nubari, where a British company mined for gold in the first few decades of the 20th century. The ruined buildings are visible here. The degree of devastation caused by the ongoing gold rush is immense, with vast areas of the desert being gouged up by bulldozers and other heavy digging equipment. For the archaeologists, the great thing about desert environments is that evidence of human activities remains largely unaltered and visible over many millennia. The evidence for recent activities will likewise remain effectively forever, changing some parts of the desert out of all recognition. There are a few advantages to this gold rush. In the middle of the desert, a petrol station has appeared. However, it can give a false sense of security. After a 230-kilometre journey across the desert from the Nile at Kerma, we found the pumps dry. The earliest evidence we have for an interest by one of the states based in the Nile Valley, in the region along the Korosko Road, has been found carved onto the rock on the side of this isolated hill. Here, on a large boulder bearing a variety of markings and depictions of animals, is a finely executed inscription in Egyptian hieroglyphs, almost certainly referring to a king of Kerma, who is also recorded in an Egyptian text from the Middle Kingdom fortress of Megissa at the upstream end of the second cataract of the Nile. He ruled a kingdom which vied with Egypt for supremacy in the Middle Nile Valley, and which was on occasion powerful enough to raid deep into Egypt itself. What the inscription signifies is unclear. On one occasion, a king of Kerma deemed it desirable to record his presence, or at least the ability of his officials, to operate in this area, 300 kilometres from his capital at Kerma, and 130 kilometres from the nearest point on the Nile. The location of the inscription is highly unusual. Almost invariably, inscriptions were placed in a prominent location where they could be readily seen. This one you could pass a few meters from and never know that it was there. That it was found at all is partly due to luck, but also to the diligence of a Sudanese member of the Castiglione's team. During the New Kingdom, that is from the 16th to the 11th centuries BC, following on from their conquest of the Kerma kingdom, there was intense interest by the Egyptians in the region to the east of the Nile, in what is now the far north of Sudan and the borderlands between it and Egypt. This map, produced by the Castigliones, shows some of the routes possibly in use at that time. The red boxes with letters are locations of inscriptions which indicate that Egyptian officials did pass by that location on one or more occasions. There is extensive evidence for this presence, represented by the remains of mining activities and their associated settlements, and of inscriptions carved on rock. Not surprisingly, the modern gold miners are operating in precisely the same areas as their ancient Egyptian predecessors had worked 3,500 years before. The arrows mark the very recent gold mining activities. The gold mining sites are characterized by a very large number of grinding stones used to reduce the gold-bearing rock to powder to aid the extraction of the gold. Many of these are readily visible on this slide. The sites indicated on this Google Earth satellite image are those where Egyptian inscriptions were studied in detail by the SARS team in 2013. The team, operating within Sudan, was unable to cross the Egyptian border, so not all the sites of interest could be visited. The actual border where it is crossed by the Korosko Road is a line in the sand. It was only with the aid of a GPS that we knew that we were actually on the international border. The Land Rover is within a few meters of that border. Here we're looking north into Egypt itself. The first detailed description of one of these Egyptian inscriptions was by the British traveller George Hoskins in February 1833. Here, in the Wadi Murat, he recorded, "On one of the rocks of the valley of the spring are some hieroglyphics. I distinguished the name of the god Horus and the hawk, the emblem of that divinity." At this location are a number of inscriptions, perhaps recording multiple visits to this place where water was readily available. It has been suggested that this water was considered a gift of the god Horus. Heru-Nefer lived in the fortress at Abu Hamed at the downstream end of the second Nile Cataract, entailing a journey for him of over 170 kilometers to Wadi Murat. Heru-Nefer was a member of a prominent priestly family at the fortress and was involved in the gold mining activities in the eastern desert. His route from Abu Hamed to Wadi Murat will have brought him past this amazing rock formation, which, although bearing a striking resemblance to representations of Horus, Lord of Abu Hamed, appears to be entirely natural. It seemed an obvious place to find evidence for Egyptian activity and inscriptions, but the SARS team were unable to find anything. Also along the route from Abu Hamed into the desert, on this prominent hill, are two Egyptian inscriptions, again referring to Heru-Nefer, perhaps carved while he was passing on two separate occasions. Some inscriptions, such as this one, are quite clear and can be easily read by the trained epigrapher. In many other cases, surface erosion, the superimposition of later rock art, or the shallow nature of the carvings makes the reading of them extremely difficult. To this can sometimes be added the inconvenient location of the inscriptions, necessitating a team effort to aid in their recording, which relies both on photography and detailed tracing of the inscriptions onto sheets of acetate. It is from these drawings that those featured in this presentation have been produced. As can be seen on this small part of the rock face, the Egyptian inscription is set amongst a palimpsest of rock art of various periods. Particular rock faces were often used both for rock art and Egyptian inscriptions, both being placed there for similar reasons, because the location was prominent and was frequented by travellers. The location may also have a particular significance to the local population and hence would have been an ideal place for the Egyptians to make their mark, even if the local inhabitants could not read their inscriptions. A few inscriptions were found in a very unusual location. Here, an ancient watercourse draining from the hills has created a cave about 62 meters in length, extending right through the low hill in the foreground. At the mouth of the cave, where it opens onto the plain, are inscriptions on either side. This one records a well-known person who went by two names, Jehuti Hotep, an Egyptian name, an indigenous name, Paitsi. This man's tomb was excavated by the Scandinavian Joint Expedition to Sudanese Nubia at Derber on the Nile, and he is also recorded on other inscriptions in the Nile Valley, where he is associated with Queen Hatshepsut. He was a member of a local family who collaborated with the Egyptians as a member of their colonial administration. The presence of his name here in the eastern desert suggests that one of his duties was connected with the oversight of gold mining in the area. The region abounds in suitable rock faces on which to place inscriptions. The localities most favoured were those which provided some shelter from the elements, principally the sun and wind, as they were presumably places where travellers stopped to rest or overnight. This would give time for the inscriptions to be carved, but would also be places where other travellers would be likely to notice them. Here are three of the inscriptions on that last site. Faced with the vast range of possible sites which may bear inscriptions, the SARS team in 2013 were very impressed by the numbers of inscriptions found by the Castigliones during their fieldwork in the region. Only one additional epigraphic site was discovered, although a very considerable effort was made to amplify the corpus provided by the earlier work. This, the newly discovered site, was typical, a large south-facing rock shelter providing shade from the sun and protection from the prevailing north wind. There was only a hint for the provision of water depots on the desert routes frequented by the Egyptians within the study area. The Castigliones had found the complete water jar pictured in the centre of this slide, while fragments of another were found by the Sars team along with a stone-lined pit capped with a stone slab, which may have been used to house a water jar. The jar found by the Castigliones was located within such a structure. This may imply that, at least at certain seasons of the year, there was sufficient surface water available to allow travel through the desert in this area. How the gold miners fared, however, being in one place for long periods of time, is another matter. As has been made clear from the location and study of the inscriptions, the Egyptians during the New Kingdom passed along sections of what was later known as the Korosko Road. However, there is no evidence that they used the route in its entirety to move from the Korosco bend on the Nile in Egypt to the Abu Hamed bend in Sudan. It has on occasion been suggested that this was the route followed by the armies of Thutmoses I and III during their campaigns against the kingdom based at Kerma around 1500 BC and in the decades thereafter. The southern limit of these campaigns was recorded on inscriptions set up on the Hagar el Merwa, 40 kilometers upstream of Abu Hamed. The main inscriptions are on this rock face, and a very fine facsimile of these inscriptions is to be found in one of the first bays in the exhibition here. The inscription was carved and in places painted on the prominent quartz outcrop and gave dire warnings to anyone who without authorization crossed this boundary. The seated figure of ram-headed Amun and the lion associated with the inscription of Thutmoses III are clearly visible. The inscription proclaimed this point as the southern boundary of the Egyptian Empire, the northern boundary of which at that time lay in the Levant. The invasion route of Thutmoses I can be documented in its early stages from contemporary rock inscriptions, the most southerly of which are at Tombos by the third cataract. From there, the only feasible route to Kugus follows the course of the Nile upstream, past Jebel Barkal and through the fourth cataract. There is every likelihood that Thutmoses III followed in his predecessor's footsteps, as may have the expedition to Kugus under Ramesses II. These campaigns were aimed at defeating and controlling the territory of the Kerma kingdom, so it would have made little sense to bypass the heartlands of the kingdom by cutting across the desert. The logistics involved in moving a large body of troops across the desert would have been daunting, even if the region was not quite as arid as it is today. Also, the advance would have been extremely risky, as there was always the possibility that the enemy could block the route at a critical point as it rejoined the river. Effective Egyptian control almost certainly ended at the foot of the fourth cataract, so there will have been little reason for them to have utilized the Korosko Road in its entirety. The Egyptians relinquished control of their southern empire probably by around 1070 BC, and we know little in detail of the region thereafter until the 8th century BC, when we can trace the emergence of a new state, the Kingdom of Kush, based initially a little downstream of the fourth cataract. The earliest Kushite burial ground is known at El Kuru, where its kings are buried. And the earliest settlement we know of was by Jebel Barkal, which is featured extensively in the exhibition. Here the Kushites took over the Egyptian New Kingdom temples and embraced many aspects of Egyptian culture and religion. While Kushite control extended to the south, at least as far as the confluence of the White and Blue Niles at modern-day Khartoum, under King Kashta they began to move into Egypt, which was totally conquered by his successor Pianki. The Kushite Empire along the Nile vastly exceeded in size that of New Kingdom Egypt. It was only surpassed following the conquest of Sudan by Muhammad Ali Pasha in the 1820s. For the first time, both ends of the Korosko Road lay within the territory of a single state. Logic would suggest that it would have been an important thoroughfare, but where is the evidence? Other Kushite cross-desert routes are known. The most famous is that across the Bayuda Desert, linking the original heartlands and religious centre of the state at Jebel Barkal, Napata, with what at a very early date became one of the principal residences of the Kushite kings at Meroe. Inscriptions tell us of the annual journey made by the king from Meroe across the desert to Napata and then on to other urban centres of the realm. Midway along this route lies the fort at Fura Wells, guarding an important water source and a narrow pass through the hills. This fort, which remains unexcavated, is the only physical evidence we have along the route for an official presence of the Kushites. The function of a recently discovered building at Et Tuena, a little to the north, of Meroitic date, is uncertain. 108 kilometres from the Nile, up the Wadi Hawar in the Libyan desert, is another fort very similar in plan and construction to that at Fura Wells. While some radiocarbon dates suggest it was constructed at the end of the New Kingdom or soon thereafter, it was certainly occupied in the early Kushite period. It either served to protect a water source on a trade route from Darfur to the Nile Valley, or was designed to block an invasion route, or both. From Napata, another route known in the recent past as the Michel Road cuts across the Nubian desert, rejoining the river by the Kushite town at Kawa. Although it is assumed that this was used by the Kushites, no wells are known along it. About 24 kilometres from Napata, the French archaeologist Jacques Renaud discovered on an isolated rock outcrop carved graffiti in Meroitic, the Kushite language first written down probably in the 3rd century BC. The graffiti presumably indicate the passage of at least some Kushite travellers along the Michel Road. Up until the construction of the tarmac road in the very recent past, this was still an extremely dangerous route. At one end of it was a sign set up warning of the dangers with a skull and crossbones to add emphasis to the message. Before the drilling of the 3 modern boreholes in the 20th century, the approximately 160-kilometre crossing must have been even more perilous. In the Bayuda Desert, to the west of the route from Meroe to Napata, already mentioned, the presence of what appears to be official structures of early Kushite date at El Marag, 60 kilometres from the Nile in the Wadi Mugaddam, suggests that there was a route passing by here which would have linked Napata to the region around the present-day Khartoum. By contrast, along the Korosko Road, evidence for a Kushite presence is very slim. Neither installations nor rock inscriptions have been discovered, suggesting, although by no means proving, that it was never used as the quickest way of communicating between Meroe, which probably became the political centre of the realm well before the royal burial ground was moved there in the 3rd century BC, and the northern part of the kingdom. Amongst the possible explanations for this may have been the focus on the trade routes along the Nile, which were firmly under Kushite control. Another important factor may have been security. The tribes inhabiting the eastern desert, through which the Korosko Road runs, were for long a threat to the states based on the Nile, be they the Egyptians, Kushites, or Romans. We know of invasions into the Nile Valley from the deserts to the east of the Nile at various periods in Kushite history, and from Roman sources it is clear that the threat from the eastern desert dwellers increased in the first few centuries AD. At one site, where we have already seen inscriptions of the Egyptian official Heru-Nefer in the New Kingdom, amongst the abundant rock art is an image of a giraffe before a palm tree. This composition is frequently seen in later Kushite Meroitic art, as here on the painted pottery vessel from the cemetery at Pharaonic in southern Egypt, and may reflect the passage of a Kushite past this point. It is not actually on the Korosko Road, but on the old route west to east from the Nile near Buhen towards the Wadi Murat. As in the Kerma period, there is no clear evidence for Kushite mining for gold in the region near the Korosko Road, although the German geologists Dietrich and Rosemary Clem have suggested that a number of the Pharaonic mining sites were also worked in the Kushite period, although at present this is supposition, as no related Kushite cultural material has been identified on those sites. As the appetite for gold for those living along the Nile was ever present, it may be that gold was still being mined, but by people resident in the desert, and then traded, passed along as gift exchange or as tribute to the coffers of the Kushite king. The mining of gold immediately adjacent to the Nile and the panning for gold within the river will have been under direct Kushite control. After the collapse of the Kushite Empire in the 4th century AD, the three states that arose within what had been its territory, the kingdoms of Nabatea, Makuria, and Alwa, were based on the Nile. There is again no archaeological evidence for their control of the area along the Korosko Road, and the first mention of the route through the eastern desert, which may correspond to the Korosko Road, indicates that it was at that time not controlled by the riverine states. As already noted, when Bishop Longinus wished to travel to the kingdom of Alwa from Nabatea in the face of opposition from Makuria, he took the eastern desert route in AD 580. It is only in the 18th century that we can finally begin to gain a clear picture of the use of the eastern desert route between Egypt and Sudan, although it seems that at that time the favoured route ran from Deroué, a little north of Aswan, to Berber in Sudan, following for much of its course along the Wadi Gabgaba. Although this route involved a much longer journey away from the Nile than the Korosko Road, there were frequent wells providing secure access to water. This was the way followed by James Bruce in the 1770s. He noted that the desert nomads had a good reputation for honesty and made a profitable living by assisting the passage of caravans, but that the level of trade had dropped off by the time of his journey. Of this earlier trade, we are largely ignorant. In 1814, Burckhardt took 22 days from Deroué to Berber, but he noted that messengers mounted on camels frequently made the journey in 8 days. He describes the route as the only one between Sudan and Egypt, and that it was that favoured by the caravans travelling north from Shendi, which lies to the north of Khartoum, and those from Sennar to Khartoum south. Although Burckhardt describes the route from Deroué to Berber as the only one, he immediately goes on to describe another route which can be identified as the Korosko Road, although he says that it leaves the Nile in Egypt at Wadi Es-Sibua, which is a little downstream of Korosco. As he notes, the great disadvantage of this route is that there is only one source of water that could be relied upon in the Wadi Murat, where it could be found a few meters below the surface. To access water, it is only necessary to dig a shallow pit into the wadi bed. The water was far from ideal, being brackish, but was an essential resource on this route. Burckhardt also noted the lack of vegetation along the way on which the camels could feed. The name Korosko Road might bring to mind a highway across the desert, but the reality was very different. The start and end points at Korosco and Abu Hamed were to some extent fixed, but as noted, Burckhardt mentions a slightly more northerly start at Wadi Es-Sibua. At its southern end, if conditions were favourable, Abu Hamed could be bypassed, the traveller staying well to the east of the Nile to avoid the very rough broken country upstream around the fifth cataract. The route itself, where it was constrained by topographical features as here in the pass known as the Berber Silic, is still clearly visible. The passage of innumerable camels has left its mark on the ground, which survived to this day, well over 100 years since the last camel caravan passed by. Elsewhere, the road could be several kilometers wide, and no trace of it remains. Although when it was in regular use, the presence of animal droppings and the skeletons of travellers and their animals that did not survive the journey would have made its course more easy to follow. Taylor noted in the middle of the 19th century that the route could be easily located by following the bones and carcasses of dead animals. In the 1890s, the British journalist Edward Knight describes the route, strewn with the bleached bones of the camels that perished on the way. There must be many thousands of these skeletons between Korosco and Murat. We could always see a half dozen or so around us. In 1820, the Ottoman Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, sent his son at the head of an army to conquer Sudan, ushering in what is referred to as the Turkiya, which lasted into the 1880s. Initially, the capital of the newly conquered land was at Sennar, but by 1834, the small settlement of Khartoum, seen here at the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, became the new capital. It is from this period that we first get detailed information about the Korosko Road, which became an important link between Egypt and its newly conquered territories, and was used extensively both for trade and communication, being by far the quickest route between Khartoum and Cairo. Perhaps the most illustrious traveller to pass along the Korosko Road was the Viceroy Muhammad Ali himself, who returned along the route from Khartoum in February to March 1839. It may have been a result of this journey that in 1845, Muhammad Ali instructed a French civil engineer, D'Arnaud, to create a military road through the desert. But D'Arnaud failed to find underground water, but was then instructed, rather against his will, to construct cisterns, which in the almost total absence of rainfall were of very little value. For very brief periods after rain, surface water is available, but as the rains are extremely sparse and erratic, these pools do little to facilitate the use of the route. Partway along the Korosko Road, a few kilometres to the south of the Berber Silic, remains were found by the SARS survey team of an official post set up and manned by Turco-Egyptian authorities. Here the route passed through a narrow wadi, forming a good point to observe and perhaps control passing caravans. On the west side of the wadi is a small isolated rock outcrop up against which are two crudely constructed rooms, and in a crevice is a large and complete water jar, and other fragments of other vessels were found in the vicinity. Of particular interest was a number of inscriptions carved on the sloping face of the outcrop, which were read and translated by our antiquities inspector from the Sudan National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, Dr. Mahmoud Suleiman Bashir, here pictured. They record the presence of a curator of this place called the Kashim el-Bab Station for some time between mid-October 1852 and September 1854. Salim also inscribed a religious text, and one perhaps of a more whimsical character. Close by, it was perhaps Salim and his colleagues who whiled away their time playing Mancala, a board game carved onto the rock. The game encounters most frequently associated with such games are pebbles and kapelndung, both of which will have been readily available here. The features just described are at number 3 on this Google Earth satellite image. Across the wadi at number 1 are other structures of uncertain function on top of the plateau. At the base of the plateau is a continuous linear feature, and on the hilltop to the northwest are 3 alumat. The features just described are marked as number 3 on this Google Earth satellite image. This is one of the features on the eastern side of the wadi, a rectangular structure with a projection on one side, which enjoys fine views into the past the Berber Silik. In the wadi bed, the linear feature appears to be a trough. It is the sort of thing one would expect to have used to water large numbers of camels, which would be extremely useful in such a location. However, there is a big problem, as there is with the water join noted by the rock outcrop. Where did the water come from? There is no evidence for a well, and the likelihood that there having been one is extremely remote. On the hilltops on the west side of the wadi are 3 alamat. These are very common features of desert routes. They are stone cairns erected in prominent positions, serving to provide markers visible from afar to guide travellers along the route. Here they are particularly important as they indicate the entrance to the pass through the mountain chain that sits athwart the Korosko Road. And here the other 2 alamat. We observed very few alamat along the Korosko Road, and in many sections, prominent and often isolated hills will instead have served as good route markers, along with the skeletons noted above. In 1862, the British traveller Samuel Baker took the Korosko Road. He writes, "We started across the Nubian desert, thus cutting off the western bend of the Nile, and in 7 days' forced camel march, we again reached the river at Abu Hamed. The journey through the desert is most fatiguing, as the march averages 15 hours a day through a wilderness of scorching sand and glowing basalt rocks. The simoon was in full force at that season, that's May, and the temperature placed in the shade by the water skins stood at 114 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not only the elements that provided a risk to travellers, however, crossing the desert. The local tribes were not adverse on occasion to preying on those passing by. One incident of this type took place in the 1820s. A party was murdered by their Ababda guides, apparently excited by the wealth those in their charge ostentatiously displayed. Another famous traveller to traverse the route was Captain Speke in the company of Lieutenant Colonel J.A. Grant, returning from their explorations of the source of the Nile. They made the journey in 1863, but in 1884, Grant took the opportunity to publish an account of the journey at a time when there was intense interest in Sudan. He writes, "Of all the journeys I have made in Africa, Abyssinia included, and in India, from the Khyber Pass to Calcutta and Bombay, this from Abu Hamed to Korosco is the very worst, from its barrenness, its heat, and from the fatigue and discomfort it necessitated." Notwithstanding these challenges, at this time the Korosko Road provided an important route for communications. A regular postal service passing along it was instituted in 1873, Arabs from the local Ababda tribe being employed on account of their prowess at crossing the desert. The journey could be done by the postman travelling alone in as little as 5 days. In 1884, Charles Gordon was appointed Governor-General of the Sudan by the Khedive of Egypt and charged by the British government with evacuating all Egyptian personnel from Sudan in the face of the threat from the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmed. Making haste in his journey south, he opted to take the Korosko Road. Leaving Korosco on the 2nd of February 1884, he arrived in Abu Hamed on the 7th of February, an extremely rapid journey. Following the death of Gordon in Khartoum in January 1885 and the establishment of the Mahdi's control over much of Sudan, the Anglo-Egyptian army withdrew down the Nile to the region around Wadi Halfa. In 1893, in order to forestall Mahdi's forces raiding into Egypt via the Korosko Road, a military post was constructed controlling and protecting the wells in the Wadi Murat. Here, the military installations can be seen a little to the southwest of the Heru Nefer inscriptions described previously. 3 small forts were built on hilltops which commanded extensive views over the wells in the wadi and over much of the surrounding countryside. While a small valley running off the main wadi was defended by a wall, and occupied by buildings to house the garrison. And here are some of the buildings still surviving today. The garrison here was regularly replaced. In 1896, the British journalist Edward Knight describes the journey of the new garrison from Korosco, the Egyptian 15th Battalion. Travelling at the hottest time of the year, the troops marched the 120 miles on foot in 65 hours. Evidence of the military presence litter the site, including cartridge cases. There are also remains of their rations. It seems that they ate a lot of tinned fish. And by way of treats, they, or at least their officers, had some fine quality biscuits. They also had smoking pipes. In 1896, the conquests of Sudan began to oust the Khalifa Abdullahi, who had succeeded the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmed on his death in 1885. The initial phase moved up the Nile from Wadi Halfa into the Dongola Reach, the movement of men and supplies being facilitated by the reconstruction and extension of the railway from Wadi Halfa as far as Kerma. The commander-in-chief of the expedition was the British General Herbert Kitchener. After the successful completion of the invasion, which established control as far upstream as the Dongola Reach, the advance to Khartoum began. This involved a march over a vast distance, which would leave an extremely long and potentially very vulnerable supply line. Building on the successes of the Dongola campaign, Kitchener decided to build a railway across the desert and then along the Nile. His first choice of the route was the line of the Korosko Road, and construction was begun, but it was soon abandoned and the plan quickly changed. It was decided to construct the railway from Wadi Halfa to rejoin the Nile at Abu Hamed. To make this feasible, two things were needed. It was essential to find water in the middle of the desert, and this was finally achieved after drilling a number of dry boreholes. The other was that it was imperative to seize control of the Nile Valley at Abu Hamed to allow the main invading force unopposed access to the Nile after the arduous desert crossing. This was achieved by sending a force upriver along the fourth cataract. Construction progressed at a rate of a mile a day, and the railway reached Abu Hamed after 230 days. The construction of the railway, which by December 1899 had reached Khartoum and ultimately extended to the Red Sea, Darfur and southwest Sudan, immediately rendered the Korosko Road defunct. In 1905, Count von Gleichen, in his two-volume work titled The Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, a compendium prepared by officers of the Sudan government, wrote, "The one main road through this country, that from Korosko to Abu Hamed via Murat, which used to be the artery through which the commerce of the Sudan flowed to Egypt, has fallen into disuse since the construction of the railway, and there are now no other tracks except those made by the nomad Arabs." That brings my story of the Korosko Road to an end. But before I finish, I must apologize as, in the context of the current exhibition on Kush during the period of its domination of Egypt, I have been able to say very little which is directly relevant. There is no clear evidence for the Kushite use of this route, of this and other routes across the eastern desert from Sudan to Egypt, nor of control of any part of that region. It may be, of course, that evidence will be found in the future, but at present, while we might like to assume that the Kushites obviously will have used the direct route linking up the Abu Hamed Bend with areas much further downstream, this does not appear to have been the case. Also, with regard to my title, what exactly have we learned about the use of the Korosko Road as an invasion route? The only documented case of an invading army crossing the eastern desert from Egypt to Sudan is that of the Anglo-Egyptian forces in 1897 to 98. That army was focused on engaging an enemy whose power base lay at Omdurman, at the Blue-White Nile confluence. It was only made feasible by the use of 19th century technology, which allowed the problems of moving large bodies of troops across an arid desert to be circumvented by the construction of a railway. What of the claim that the ancient Egyptians used this route in their invasion of the Nile Valley as far upstream as Kurgus 3,500 years earlier? There is simply no evidence for this, and, as noted earlier, it would not have suited the strategic goals of the Egyptian invaders to bypass the population centres and power base of their enemy. Much better to force a decisive engagement on the Nile and then overhaul the defeated population by marching through the length and breadth of their territory. To this may be added the logistic difficulties of moving a large body of men and also female members of the royal family through the harsh desert. Accounts of the hardships and dangers of travelling along the Korosko Road throughout the 19th century are directly relevant to all earlier crossings of the eastern desert routes, at least since the climate reached its current hyper-arid level at the beginning of the first millennium BC. Prior to the availability of the camel, it was perhaps only the lure of gold that forced the Nile dwellers to risk the perils of eastern desert travel. Even with the camel, it was a dangerous undertaking. Writing in 1905, Ward, in his book, Our Sudan, Its Pyramids and Progress, records, "It is hard to believe that not so many years ago an entire caravan from Korosco perished in the sandstorm in attempting to cross it." There is much still to learn about the Eastern Desert in general and the cross-desert routes in particular. A number of archaeological missions are currently working in the area, and no doubt our information will be greatly enhanced in the future, but perhaps not significantly changed. Thank you very much for your attention.